say to the honourable gentleman, give me this, I will not tolerate such behaviour. If you want to go out now, but if you stand again, I will order you out. Make your mind up. Either shut up and get out. I warn the honourable member that if there's protesting carrying out, just shut up a minute.
The chamber of the House of Commons had started like any other day. Members murmured across benches, papers rustled, and the usual rhythm of political theatre carried on. But beneath the surface, tension was already thick, as though history itself was waiting for a moment to erupt. When Nigel Farage entered the chamber, that tension snapped into focus, the air shifted, conversations faltered, heads turned. For years, he had been branded an agitator, a man destined to stir controversy but never hold real power. Yet in that instant, his presence filled the room with a quiet, unnerving authority. He did not shout, he did not grandstand. He walked with calm assurance, and even his silence spoke louder than words. Members of Parliament, hardened by decades of debates, instinctively straightened in their seats, as though acknowledging a force they had once mocked but could no longer ignore. As he rose to speak, the Commons fell into an almost unnatural silence. Every eye was locked on him, every breath drawn in anticipation. Farage's voice cut through the chamber like steel, measured, sharp, relentless. He did not begin with pleasantries or protocols. He struck immediately at the heart of the matter. The failure of leadership, the betrayal of the people, and the illusion of authority that had propped up the two major parties for decades. The British people have been lied to, he declared, his words echoing with a precision that made the chamber tremble. They have been abandoned by Labour and betrayed by the Conservatives, and today that ends. Each sentence landed like a hammer blow. He dismantled Labour's credibility piece by piece, accusing Starmer of empty promises, economic weakness and moral cowardice. The attack was surgical, exposing every flaw and leaving no refuge for the man once considered unshakable. Keir Starmer, usually calm and composed, sat visibly shaken. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came, only silence, broken by the thunder of Farage's accusations. The man who had promised renewal for Labour appeared pale, frozen, his authority evaporating before the eyes of the nation. Farage did not spare the Conservatives either. With ruthless clarity, he turned to the Tory benches and unleashed the same merciless scrutiny. Years of mismanagement, arrogance, and broken commitments were laid bare. "You let this country rot," he said coldly, his words hanging heavy in the air. Some MPs laughed nervously, but it was laughter laced with fear, as though they sensed the foundations beneath them were beginning to collapse. For decades, both parties had assumed they were untouchable, that power would always shift safely between them. But in that chamber, at that moment, it became clear their monopoly was finished. The weight of his words crushed the silence of the room. Labour's front bench sat in stunned disbelief, while the Conservatives shifted uneasily in their seats. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, stared down at her papers, her hands trembling slightly as Farage eviscerated her record with brutal precision. "You are out of your depth," he told her, "and the people are paying for your failures." She could not respond. None of them could. The chamber, usually a place of shouting and bluster, was reduced to hushed whispers and uneasy glances, and then the impossible unfolded. The Speaker of the House, a figure known for neutrality, stood. His words shattered centuries of expectation and protocol in front of a stunned nation. He declared Nigel Farage the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The chamber erupted, not in unity, but in chaos. Some shouted in disbelief, others sat in frozen silence, and millions watching from home gasped at a reality they could scarcely comprehend. Keir Starmer sat motionless, his face drained of colour, his composure destroyed. The man who once embodied control and discipline was now the picture of defeat. Farage, meanwhile, stood calm, his expression unreadable. He did not gloat. He did not raise his arms in triumph. He allowed silence itself to become his victory, a weapon more devastating than any cheer or applause. It was not just a political upset, it was a funeral for the old order, a burial of the illusions that had sustained British politics for decades. The carefully crafted image of stability had been ripped apart in a single, unrelenting afternoon. And at the centre of it all stood Nigel Farage, no longer the outsider, but the reckoning. The shock of the Speaker's declaration rippled outward like an earthquake. Within moments, Westminster, a place built on centuries of rigid order and tradition, was plunged into chaos. MPs glanced around the chamber in disbelief, as though seeking confirmation that they had truly heard the words that had just been spoken. It was not a misstatement. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was the undeniable reality. Nigel Farage had been declared the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. For a chamber accustomed to scripted debates and predictable outcomes, the atmosphere was unrecognisable. Whispers turned into frantic mutters, and seasoned politicians who had weathered scandal after scandal now sat pale and shaken, unable to process what had just unfolded before them. Keir Starmer remained frozen, a hollow figure in the eye of the storm. His reputation had been built on discipline, order and control, but all of it had shattered in real time. His aides leaned toward him desperately, whispering reassurances, urging him to compose himself, but it was no use. His hands trembled. His eyes darted aimlessly across the chamber, searching for an anchor in a sea of humiliation. For years, Starmer had projected an image of calm leadership, of steady authority in turbulent times. But the mask had been ripped away. What the British public saw now was not a leader, but a man broken under the crushing weight of truth. Farage, meanwhile, stood unshaken. His presence dominated the chamber with a calm authority that no one could deny. He did not bask in triumph or raise his voice to command the moment. Instead, he allowed silence to stretch, letting the enormity of what had happened settle like a storm cloud over Westminster. Every MP, every viewer at home felt the shift. This was not politics as usual. This was the collapse of the old order. Then, with deliberate precision, Farage spoke again. His words were not for the politicians before him, but for the millions watching across the nation. He addressed the forgotten voters, the working-class communities left behind, the citizens who had grown weary of empty promises and false hope. For too long, he said, his voice carrying through the chamber and into living rooms across Britain, the people of this country have been ignored, their voices silenced, their struggles dismissed. Today, that changes. Today, power is no longer the property of elites in Westminster. Today, it returns to the people. The effect was electric. Across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens, their attention captured by words that felt less like a speech and more like a declaration of war on the establishment. In coffee shops, offices and homes, conversations stopped as citizens realised they were witnessing history unfold. Social media erupted instantly, clips of Starmer's trembling collapse and Farage's unflinching authority spreading like wildfire. Hashtags trended globally within minutes, framing the moment as nothing short of revolutionary. Inside Parliament, Labour MPs sat stunned. Some avoided looking at their leader, ashamed of the humiliation on display. Others stole fearful glances at Farage, as though recognising that the ground beneath their political careers had just given way. Rachel Reeves, once confident at the front bench, sat visibly shaken. Farage's words had cut too deep, leaving no space for excuses or spin. She knew that her record had been dismantled in front of millions, her credibility reduced to dust. The Conservatives fared no better. Farage turned his piercing gaze upon them, reminding the chamber that their years in power had left Britain weakened and divided. "You presided over decline," he told them coldly. "You let ambition matter more than service. You let this country rot." The words landed with devastating precision. Tory MPs shifted uncomfortably, their faces etched with unease. They had dismissed Farage for decades as a fringe agitator, a man whose bark would never match his bite. But in that chamber, they finally understood their mistake. He was no longer on the outside. He was inside, at the very heart of power, and they were powerless to stop him. The laughter that occasionally bubbled through the chamber was not relief, but fear. It was jagged, uneasy, the laughter of those who realised their time was ending. For years, Westminster had thrived on ritual, booming debates, rehearsed arguments, the endless theatre of politics, but Farage had stripped it all bare. This was no longer performance. This was exposure. Raw, brutal, undeniable. Outside, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Newsrooms scrambled to rewrite headlines. Pundits abandoned their carefully prepared talking points, struggling to interpret what had just happened. International media outlets cut into broadcasts to report on the unprecedented upheaval in the UK. Around the world, governments and diplomats watched in disbelief as Britain's carefully maintained image of stability collapsed in a single afternoon. Allies questioned what this would mean for trade, security, and global alliances. Rivals observed with fascination, aware that the political earthquake in Westminster could shift the balance of power across Europe and beyond. Back in Westminster, the silence following the Speaker's declaration grew heavier. Starmer sat slumped, broken under the weight of humiliation, his reputation disintegrating in real time. The Labour Party, once the rising hope of the nation, now looked directionless, fractured and exposed. The Conservatives, stripped of their veneer of control, appeared equally vulnerable, and at the centre stood Nigel Farage, calm, steady, unshaken. The man who had been dismissed for decades as a disruptor had, in a single moment, rewritten history. This was not politics as usual. It was not a change of government in the ordinary sense. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Britain, a chapter defined not by the traditions of the past, but by the raw force of conviction. Farage had not taken power through backroom deals or quiet negotiations. He had seized it openly, boldly, in the heart of the Commons, with words that had dismantled two great parties at once. The question no longer was whether Keir Starmer could recover or whether the Conservatives could regroup. The question was far greater, more daunting and more historic. What happens to Britain now that Nigel Farage has claimed the mantle of leadership? As the echoes of the Speaker's declaration reverberated through Parliament, the full scale of the upheaval began to sink in. Outside the Commons chamber, the hallways of Westminster buzzed with panic. Aides rushed back and forth, their phones pressed to their ears, voices hushed but urgent. Journalists swarmed the lobby, shoving microphones toward any MP willing to speak, hungry for even a single reaction to the seismic moment that had just unfolded. But most MPs avoided the press entirely. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief, and their steps hurried, as though escaping the weight of the collapse pressing down on the very building itself. Inside the chamber, Keir Starmer sat motionless. He had entered Parliament that morning as the leader of the opposition, a man with the ambition of one day stepping into number 10. By the afternoon, that ambition lay in ruins. His reputation, built over years of projecting calm, authority and competence, had evaporated in minutes under Farage's assault. The cameras had caught everything, his trembling hands, his hollow stare, his inability to respond. These were not moments that could be spun or reinterpreted. They were permanent scars, etched into the national memory. Starmer's image of control had been reduced to rubble, and he knew it. His silence spoke louder than words, the silence of defeat. Farage, by contrast, embodied composure. His very presence seemed to fill the chamber with a gravity that no one could resist. He did not pace. He did not flail. He did not seek validation from the crowd. He simply stood, calm and assured, as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The silence that followed each of his statements was not awkward. It was deliberate. He wielded silence like a weapon, forcing every MP, every viewer to linger on his words and absorb their weight. In those pauses, the authority of the old order dissolved and his authority grew. The Labour front bench was in disarray. Rachel Reeves sat rigid, her face pale, her credibility dismantled in front of millions. Her record as Chancellor had been shredded with a few ruthless sentences, leaving her no ground to defend herself. Around her, fellow shadow ministers exchanged frantic whispers, but even they knew the truth. There was no strategy left, no statement, no rebuttal, no carefully crafted line could undo what had just happened. Farage had not merely exposed weaknesses, he had annihilated their entire foundation. The Conservative benches fared no better. Years of mismanagement and broken promises had been laid bare with merciless clarity. Tory MPs who once viewed themselves as untouchable now shifted uneasily in their seats. Some stared at their shoes, others glanced nervously toward Farage, as though recognising for the first time that their grip on power had been broken. They had mocked him for years, dismissed him as a gadfly on the fringes of politics. But in that moment, they saw the truth. The outsider had become the insider, and he was dismantling them from within. The chamber itself seemed to shrink under the weight of the reckoning. For centuries, Westminster had thrived on ritual, theatrical debates, rehearsed arguments, the endless performance of politics. But Farage had stripped away the performance, leaving only raw truth and exposed weakness. It was not a debate, it was an execution, and the old order was the victim. Beyond Parliament, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News networks cut away from scheduled programming to cover the unfolding crisis live. Headlines screamed of Farage's rise and Starmer's humiliation. Social media became a battlefield of disbelief and celebration. Clips of Starmer's trembling collapse circulated endlessly, while Farage's words were replayed with captions like, "The moment Westminster fell." Hashtags trended globally within minutes. Farage PM, Starmer broken, #end of the old order. In homes across Britain, citizens who had long tuned out of politics now found themselves glued to screens. Coffee shops, pubs, offices and living rooms became arenas of debate as people replayed the moment over and over. Some reacted with shock, others with elation, but all shared the same realisation. This was not just another speech, not just another day in Parliament. This was history. For ordinary Britons, the spectacle was more than entertainment. It was vindication. For years, they had felt ignored, their struggles dismissed, their voices unheard. Now, for the first time, someone had stood in the heart of power and said what they had always known. The system was broken, and those who claimed to lead had failed them. Farage's words gave voice to a frustration that had simmered for decades, and in that moment, millions felt represented, heard and empowered in a way they had not experienced in a generation. International observers watched in disbelief. Across Europe, news outlets scrambled to analyse what Farage's rise would mean for alliances, trade and diplomacy. In Washington, officials privately admitted they had never expected to see him standing at the helm of Britain's government. In Brussels, there was alarm and uncertainty. After all, the man who had driven Britain out of the European Union was now in command of the entire nation. Around the world, leaders recalibrated their assumptions, aware that British politics had entered uncharted territory. Back inside Westminster, Starmer's team struggled in vain to contain the fallout. Aides whispered frantically, drafting statements, planning press briefings. But their efforts were meaningless. The narrative was already out of their hands. Every headline, every broadcast, every viral clip told the same story. Farage had risen, Starmer had collapsed, and the Speaker had shattered the old order with a single declaration. The Labour Party faced an existential crisis. Some MPs whispered about resignation, others about leadership challenges. But deep down, they knew none of it mattered. This was not about policy disputes or factional struggles. It was about perception. And perception had already hardened into reality. Starmer was broken, Labour was finished, and Farage had claimed authority not with backroom deals, but with words so powerful that they had reshaped the nation in real time. The Conservatives fared little better. Once confident in their ability to survive any storm, they now found themselves exposed. Their arrogance had blinded them to the threat. They had underestimated Farage for too long, and now they were witnessing the price. Fear, not strategy, defined their reactions. They whispered among themselves, but none dared speak too loudly. They knew what had just happened. They had watched their rival dismantle Labour and realised he could just as easily dismantle them. By evening, Westminster had become unrecognisable. The air was thick with dread, anticipation and disbelief. The gilded halls of Parliament, once symbols of stability, now felt like ruins. Shadows of an order that had collapsed in the span of a single afternoon. At the centre of it all stood Nigel Farage, calm and unflinching. He did not gloat. He did not revel. He simply existed as the undeniable force that had reduced centuries of tradition to dust. This was not just a political shift, it was a reckoning. The old order had fallen and Britain stood at the dawn of something new, uncertain and unstoppable. The question that lingered was simple yet terrifying. If Farage could dismantle the two great parties in an afternoon, what else could he do?